Hello. My wife told me to sign the papers or she'd file for divorce and take half of my inheritance. I let her go ahead with it. She was furious when she finally learned how much she'd actually get. My name is Charles. I am 39 and I work as an auto mechanic in Phoenix, Arizona. My days are pretty straightforward. I open the shop early, deal with a steady line of cars, and usually come home smelling like motor oil and brake dust. I have lived in the same area for about 15 years. Life is simple and structured for me. Work during the week, some overtime when the shop gets busy, and weekends usually spent fixing small things around the house or watching games with a couple of friends. I met my wife Luna when I was 33. She is 35 now and works as a nail technician at a busy salon across town. We dated for 4 years before getting married. We have been married for a little over 2 years now. We live in a small house that I bought a few years before we met. There are no kids involved, and our finances are mostly separate except for the shared bills like utilities and groceries. Luna has always had a much sharper personality than me. She is the kind of person who likes to win arguments and have the last word. I am more laid back and usually prefer to solve problems quietly instead of turning everything into a fight. For most of our relationship, that difference was manageable. The problem that eventually destroyed the marriage started about 7 months ago when my grandmother passed away. She lived in Texas, and I had always been close to her growing up. She owned a small house and had some investments that she had been slowly building for decades. When everything was settled, I found out she had left everything to me. It was not some billionaire-level inheritance, but it was still a serious amount of money. I told Luna about it the same week the paperwork came in. At first, she seemed thrilled. Within a few days, the tone of the conversations started to change. She began talking about upgrades. A bigger house. A brand new SUV. Taking time off work for a while. I told her most of the money would stay invested. My grandmother had spent her whole life building it carefully, and I planned to treat it the same way. That was the first time she snapped at me and said I was being selfish with money that was supposed to belong to both of us anyway. That sentence stuck with me because it was the first moment I realized Luna and I were looking at that inheritance in completely different ways. At first, I thought Luna's reaction was just excitement. Most people don't hear the word inheritance and immediately start thinking about long-term investment plans. They think about what they can buy. I understood that. The problem was how quickly she became aggressive about it. Within 2 weeks, she was bringing it up almost every day. Sometimes it was small comments while we were eating dinner. She would say things like we could finally move somewhere nicer or that her coworkers' husbands bought them better cars. Other times it turned into full arguments. One night, she sat down next to me on the couch and showed me a listing for a new house about 20 minutes away. It was easily 3 times the price of our current place. I told her the same thing I had already said a few times. The inheritance was going to stay mostly invested. I planned to keep working. I planned to keep living in the house I already owned. The money was security, not a shopping spree. She stared at me for a few seconds like I had just insulted her personally. Then she started in with the comments. She said I was acting cheap. She said normal husbands actually want to upgrade their lives. Then she said something that really shifted the tone of the whole conversation. She said if we were married, then the money should be half hers anyway. I reminded her of something very simple. The inheritance came from my grandmother, and it went directly to me. It wasn't something we built together. And more importantly, the house we lived in had also been mine before the marriage. That explanation did not calm her down. If anything, it made her more irritated. Over the next few weeks, her attitude got noticeably worse. She started making comments about my spending habits, even though I have always been the one paying the larger share of the bills. She complained that I was treating her like a roommate instead of a wife. What really caught my attention was how confident she sounded every time she talked about divorce laws. She kept repeating the same sentence. If we split, everything gets divided anyway. At the time, I did not argue much about it. I just listened. And I made a quiet decision to check something important before this situation went any further. I am a mechanic, not a lawyer, but I am not careless either. Luna kept repeating that divorce would automatically split everything down the middle. She said it with a lot of confidence, almost like she had already looked into it. That made me curious. So one afternoon after work, I stopped by a small law office not far from the shop. It was nothing dramatic, just a short consultation with a family attorney. I explained the situation plainly. Married a little over 2 years. House purchased before marriage. Inheritance received after my grandmother passed. I asked him one simple question. If my wife filed for divorce tomorrow, what exactly would she be entitled to? The lawyer didn't even hesitate. He explained that inheritances are usually considered separate property as long as they are not mixed into joint accounts or used in shared assets. I told him the money had gone straight into an investment account under my name. He nodded and said that was exactly the right move. Then we talked about the house. Same situation. Since I bought it years before the marriage and it was only in my name, it would generally stay mine. The only things that would realistically be divided were things we purchased together during the marriage. Furniture, some shared savings, normal household stuff. Nothing remotely close to half of the inheritance. The consultation lasted maybe 30 minutes. I paid the fee, thanked him, and went back to work. What stuck with me the most was something he said while I was leaving. He said sometimes one partner becomes very confident about money they legally do not control, and that confidence usually disappears once the paperwork actually starts. I didn't tell Luna about that meeting. There was no point yet. But over the next couple weeks her attitude kept getting worse. The comments became more aggressive. One night during dinner, she told me something that honestly sounded more like a threat than a conversation. She said I could either start acting like a husband and share the money, or she would force the issue through divorce. Then she leaned back in her chair and said something that she clearly believed was the winning move. Sign the papers when the time comes, or the court will take half anyway. At that point, I had already heard everything I needed to hear. After that conversation, I stopped arguing with Luna about the inheritance. There was no point continuing the same fight over and over again. She had already convinced herself that she was entitled to half of it. What changed for me was how calmly she started bringing up divorce. It stopped sounding like a threat made in anger. Instead, it sounded like a plan she thought would work in her favor. About 3 weeks after that dinner argument, she came home late from the salon one night and immediately started another conversation about money. She had clearly been thinking about it all day. She told me one of her co-workers had just moved into a bigger house, and she was tired of living in what she called my starter home. I reminded her that the house was fully paid off except for a small remaining balance. Low bills. Quiet neighborhood. 10 minutes from my shop. From my perspective, it was exactly the kind of situation people try to reach. From her perspective, it was embarrassing. She said she was tired of living like we were broke when I was sitting on what she called a pile of money. I told her again the inheritance was staying invested. I wasn't quitting my job. I wasn't buying a luxury house. And I definitely wasn't draining the account for things we didn't need. That's when she finally snapped in a way that made the situation crystal clear. She stood there in the kitchen and said if I was going to act like that, then I should just sign the divorce papers and let the court deal with it. She said it very casually, like she had already decided that would solve everything. Then she added the part she clearly believed was her strongest argument. She said once the divorce started, the judge would split everything down the middle anyway. Half the inheritance, half the house, half of everything. She even told me I could make it easier by signing quickly instead of wasting both of our time. I looked at her for a second and asked one simple question. Are you sure that is how it works? She rolled her eyes and said of course it was. According to her, the law protects wives from husbands hiding money. Then she said something that honestly surprised me. She told me if I refused to cooperate, she would file the divorce herself. So I shrugged and gave her the only answer that made sense at that point. I told her she should go ahead and do exactly that. Luna did not expect that answer. When I told her to go ahead and file, she just stood there in the kitchen staring at me for a few seconds. I could almost see the gears turning in her head. She clearly thought I was bluffing. She asked me if I was serious. I told her yes. If she believed divorce would solve the problem, then she should do it. The conversation ended there that night. She stormed off to the bedroom and slammed the door like she usually did when an argument didn't go her way. But something had changed. For the next few days, she started acting unusually calm. Not nicer, just calculated. She stopped bringing up the inheritance directly, but she started making little comments that sounded like preparations. Things like how complicated divorce paperwork can be, how judges usually side with fairness, how husbands sometimes try to hide assets. Every time she said something like that, she would look at me like she expected me to panic. I didn't. About 2 weeks later, I came home from work and found an envelope sitting on the kitchen counter. Inside were divorce papers. She had actually done it. Luna walked out of the bedroom while I was flipping through the documents. She looked strangely confident, almost like someone who thought they had already won something. She told me I should sign them quickly so we could both move on. Then she added the part she clearly enjoyed saying. She said once the divorce was finalized, she would finally get what she deserved. Half of everything. She said it slowly like she wanted to watch my reaction. I asked her if she had actually spoken to a lawyer. She said she didn't need one yet because the law was obvious. Marriage means shared assets. Her words, not mine. Then she pushed a pen across the counter toward me. She told me if I signed now the process would go faster. Otherwise she would drag it through court and still end up with the same result. The strange part was how relaxed I felt in that moment. I already knew something she didn't. So I picked up the papers and told her I would have my attorney review them first before signing anything. The look on her face changed instantly. Not fear. More like irritation that I wasn't playing the role she expected. What Luna didn't realize was that the moment she filed those papers, the situation had already stopped being the kind of fight she thought she was having. The next day after Luna handed me the papers, I took them to the same attorney I had spoken to earlier. He looked through everything carefully while I explained what had been happening the last couple months. Her demands. The constant talk about taking half of the inheritance. The way she was so confident the court would force a full split. He nodded a few times while reading. Then he said something that honestly made the whole situation feel almost predictable to him. He told me this kind of misunderstanding happens more often than people think. One spouse assumes every dollar the other person has automatically becomes marital property. But the law doesn't actually work that way. He pointed out something important in the papers Luna had filed. She had listed the inheritance as a marital asset. Not just that. She had written down an estimated value that was completely wrong. She had guessed a number that was almost double the real amount. Apparently, she had built an entire plan around money she didn't even know the real size of. My lawyer asked me a couple simple questions. Had the inheritance ever been placed in a joint account? No. Had any of it been used to buy shared property? No. Had Luna contributed financially to the house I bought before the marriage? Also no. He leaned back in his chair and said something that made me laugh a little. He said your wife is about to be very disappointed. Then he explained the realistic outcome. The inheritance stays mine. The house stays mine. The only things likely to be divided are normal items purchased during the marriage. Some furniture. A small joint savings account we used for emergencies. A few basic assets like that. Nothing remotely close to half of anything significant. I asked him if there was anything I needed to do differently moving forward. He said no. Just let the process play out. And most importantly, don't mix the inheritance with anything shared. Before I left his office, he added one more comment. He said sometimes people start divorce thinking they are about to gain a fortune. Then they realize halfway through that they misread the entire situation. A few weeks later, the first financial disclosures were exchanged. That was the moment Luna finally saw the real numbers. Financial disclosure is the stage where both sides have to show the real numbers. Actual accounts. Actual balances. Actual property. No guesses. No assumptions. Just paperwork. Up until that point, Luna had been walking around the house acting like someone who was already planning her new life. She spent more time out with friends and barely talked to me unless it was about the divorce timeline. She even mentioned a couple times that she was looking at apartments in nicer parts of the city. I didn't comment on any of it. Then the financial documents arrived. I was at work when she got them. I found out later she had opened the envelope sometime in the afternoon. When I came home that evening, the house was completely quiet. Luna was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers spread out in front of her. She looked confused. Not angry. Not confident. Just confused. She asked me one question almost immediately. Why isn't the inheritance listed as marital property? I told her because it isn't. She flipped through the pages again like she expected something different to appear the second time. Then she asked why the house wasn't listed as shared property either. Same answer. Because I bought it before we got married. She stared at the paperwork for another minute. Then she asked where the rest of the money was. That question told me everything. She had built an entire plan around a number she imagined in her head. The actual inheritance was still significant, but nowhere near the amount she had been bragging about to her friends. More importantly, it wasn't even part of the marital estate, which meant the only numbers she was actually entitled to see were the small joint accounts and household assets. I could almost see the moment the realization started forming in her head. She asked if the court would still force the inheritance to be divided later. I told her she should probably ask her lawyer that question. That was when her tone finally changed. For the first time since she threatened divorce, Luna looked genuinely unsettled, because she was starting to realize something very important. The plan she thought would make her rich was about to do the exact opposite. The night Luna saw the real financial disclosure was the first time she stopped acting like someone who had already won. But she didn't suddenly become reasonable. Instead, she switched to a different tactic. She kept insisting there had to be some kind of loophole. She said the court would still force the inheritance to be split because we were married. I told her the same thing I had already said before. She should ask her lawyer. The conversation turned into another argument within minutes. She accused me of hiding money. I reminded her that the whole point of financial disclosure was that every account had already been documented. Then she tried another angle. She said even if the inheritance stayed mine, she was still entitled to half of the house because we had lived there during the marriage. I gave her the same answer again. That was also a question for her lawyer. By that point, it was obvious the situation had shifted. She had expected divorce to give her control over money she never actually had. Instead, she was staring at paperwork showing she would walk away with a fraction of what she imagined. Her voice kept getting louder. Eventually, she started saying the house should still be sold so she could take her half. That was when I ended the conversation. I told her very calmly that the house was not being sold. And more importantly, she wasn't going to keep living there either. She stared at me like she thought I was bluffing. I wasn't. I reminded her of something very simple. The house was mine before the marriage, and she was the one who filed for divorce. So there was no reason for us to keep living under the same roof. Then I told her she had 24 hours to pack her things and leave. Clothes, personal items, anything she brought with her. She immediately started yelling that I couldn't just throw her out. I stayed calm and repeated the same thing. 24 hours. If she refused to leave after that, the next step would involve lawyers and formal notice. The argument died down pretty quickly after that. The next day, she spent most of the afternoon packing bags and boxes. Late that evening, she loaded everything into her car and drove away without saying a word. Once she was gone, I changed the door code, locked the garage, and blocked her number. From that point forward, every conversation would go through the lawyers. After Luna left the house, things became quiet very quickly. For the first time in months, there were no arguments waiting when I walked through the door after work. No comments about money. No random threats about divorce. Just silence. Honestly, it felt like the house had reset back to the way it used to be before all of this started. The next few weeks were handled almost entirely by the attorneys. Since I had blocked her number, every communication went through email between the lawyers. That was intentional. My attorney had recommended it from the start once things became hostile. Apparently, Luna had a much different tone when she spoke to her lawyer compared to how she acted at home. Once the financial disclosures were fully reviewed, her side started asking a lot of questions. Not aggressive questions, clarifying ones. Things about the house purchase date. Things about when exactly the inheritance was received. Things about whether any of the money had ever been transferred into shared accounts. The answer to all of those questions stayed the same. No. My attorney handled everything calmly and just kept sending the documentation that already existed. The house purchase records, the investment account statements, the inheritance transfer paperwork. After about a month, something interesting happened. Luna's lawyer sent over a proposal for settlement. It was very different from the confidence she had shown when she first filed the divorce. Instead of demanding half of everything, the proposal only asked for a portion of the small joint savings account and some furniture. Basically the exact things my lawyer had predicted from the beginning. No mention of the inheritance. No claim on the house. Just the normal division of things we actually purchased together during the marriage. When my lawyer showed me the proposal, he smiled slightly and said something simple. Reality usually arrives eventually. Apparently, Luna had finally gotten the legal explanation she probably should have asked for months earlier. The person who threatened to take half of everything was now negotiating over a few $1,000s and a couch. I approved the settlement immediately. At that point, I had no interest in dragging anything out longer than necessary. There was only one part left before everything became final. The final step was the court hearing to finalize the divorce. It wasn't dramatic the way people sometimes imagine. There was no shouting and no big courtroom speeches. Most of it was just paperwork being confirmed. Luna and I both had to be present, but we didn't interact directly. Our lawyers handled almost everything. The judge went through the settlement agreement and asked a few basic questions to confirm that both sides understood what they were signing. Division of the joint savings account. Division of the furniture we bought together. No shared property beyond that. When the judge got to the section about major assets, he asked the standard question about whether there were any disputes remaining regarding separate property. Both lawyers answered no. That was the moment the entire situation officially ended. The inheritance remained mine. The house remained mine. The settlement amount Luna received was roughly what we had sitting in the shared savings account, plus a few household items. Nothing even close to what she had been threatening to take for months. The whole hearing took less than 20 minutes. Afterward, we both walked out of the courthouse in different directions. That was the last time I saw her. A few days later, I heard through a mutual friend that Luna was furious about how everything turned out. Apparently, she had spent months telling people she was going to walk away from the marriage with a huge payout. Instead, she left with a used couch, some savings we had built together, and a divorce she pushed for herself. Meanwhile, my life went right back to normal. I still wake up early and open the shop. I still work on cars all day, and I still live in the same house I bought years before the marriage. The inheritance is still sitting in the investment account where it has been since the day it arrived. The difference now is that the house is quiet again. Looking back at the whole situation, the strangest part is how avoidable it was. Luna didn't lose money because I tricked her. She lost it because she never actually checked how the law worked before threatening to use it. Bye-bye.